You're listening to Edge of Faith, a multimedia magazine where we discuss art and culture through a Christian lens. Well, David, Marybeth, thank you so much for stopping and taking the time to talk to us today. How are y'all?
Good. Good. How are you doing?
Doing wonderful. Thanks for asking.
Wonderful.
So maybe we should just jump straight in. David, this first question, I guess, will be for you. Could you explain the concept of moral apologetics and why you believe it's on the comeback?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Moral apologetics, when people hear that phrase, that they might not know what that means. You might just mean, right, doing apologetics morally, I suppose. Now, that's a good idea, because if you want to do apologetics, you should certainly do it in a moral way and treating people with respect and dignity and that sort of thing, not being rude. And too often times apologetics is done poorly in that way. So, that's kind of like cheating on an ethics test or something. That's just inappropriate. So there's that kind of meaning. But the specific sort of meaning that we're usually driving at with the phrase moral apologetics is apologetics, a rational defense of the faith, pointing specifically to moral arguments for God's existence. And there's a lot of history to this kind of argument. I mean, it traces back to Immanuel Kant and guys like that. Subsequent to him, especially in England, a great many major thinkers and philosophers and scholars devoted some of their best efforts to laying out versions of the moral argument. Guys like William Sorley and A.E. Taylor, a number of these guys, in fact, did their Gifford lectures on it in Scotland, a very prestigious, series of lectures there on natural theology, and some of their best work was in this area. So in England, this was really big through the 1800s and early 1900s. And then around 1950, you had C.S. Lewis give a version of the moral argument in the book One of Mere Christianity, and that was a very popularized version of the argument that caught a lot of people's attention, and that he laid out right in the middle of World War II. So, this was an argument that spoke to people where they were at, even in the midst of a lot of tumult and trouble and trial. So it has a lot of staying power. And then in the last several decades, we have seen a real resurgence of interest in the moral argument here in the United States, where top-notch analytic philosophers have been devoting some of their best efforts and energies to laying out very smart, very rigorous versions of the moral argument. And so someone like William Lane Craig says that though the moral argument's not his favorite, when he goes to college campuses to do apologetics and conduct debates and the like, that the moral argument tends to be the most effective and the most persuasive. And Al Plantinga, the great Christian philosopher, has said, when asked which argument from natural theology is probably the very best one, he thinks it's the moral argument. So it has just this tremendous potential. It can be cast at all sorts of levels. It appeals to both the head and the heart. And there's a lot of cutting-edge work to be done in this area. And I would really encourage people who have an interest, to pursue it. We're really hoping for just an army of moral apologists to rise up and do top-level cutting-edge work and connecting it to Christianity, to spiritual formation, to what the Bible has to say, to meta-ethics, and very exciting area.
Well, I think you got me excited. Let's just go do that right now. No, I'm kidding. So, no, it is a wonderful subject. I've been very interested in apologetics and Christian philosophy for a while, and those are some big hitters you mentioned. And even though it's a heavy subject, it is very interesting, and I think it helps both the believer and the unbeliever alike to think through some of their issues.
Sure does.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Marybeth, I noticed that David's got a PhD in philosophy. Yours is in English. What was it that made you guys decide to write this wonderful book together?
Well, good question. David originally was going to write the book on his own. He'd done a lot of scholarly work with Jerry Walls through Oxford University Press. He's been involved with the moral argument for 20-plus years, 25 years. It's been really something that's been on his mind that he keeps returning to. It really is his life vocation to pursue this. So originally he was going to take the scholarly work that he had done with Jerry Walls, 2 books with Oxford, Good God, which is a positive case for theistic ethics, and God and Cosmos, which is a critique of naturalistic ethics, sort of pull both of those together, and there's actually a 3rd book that they're working on currently, History of the Moral Argument, and pull all of that material together and present it to kind of a lay audience. And he was originally spearheading that, undertaking the project on his own, but through just naturally conversations that we had, just the ways that we would bounce ideas off each other, it became very clear that the book was not simply his. So it was almost like acknowledging the reality of the conversation and the book kind of coming together organically. And so I think because he was moving the material kind of from an academic audience more to a lay audience, that was some of the stuff that I was able to contribute. I've done some work with Christ and pop culture, with writing and editing, and so have been focused some on kind of translating ideas to the general public. Of course, my background in literature, that shows up quite a bit in the book. And so I think also my being outside of philosophy in kind of seeing ways to translate some of the philosophical, more technical terms to people that might not be familiar with them, and really just opening up the book. I think it so came together, again, organically. One of the things I think that you can see in the book itself is just so much of our personality, and that would not have been possible. It's not just his personality and my personality, but almost like the relationship personality, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Some of the jokes in the book would not have been possible with just one or the other of us working together, working apart from each other, but the working together really enhanced, I think, just the richness of the material and the kind of having the really sometimes challenging philosophical material, but adding illustrations and clarification points where I can see that people who aren't immersed in philosophy might have questions. So, yeah, I think it's a richer, stronger book for both of us having done it together. And again, it just kind of turned out that way.
Well, great. Yeah, as I was reading that, I think you're right. I picked up on y'all's personalities. I thought, man, they're kind of snarky. You'd be great at a dinner party. And I think that's a wonderful thing to bring to a subject such as philosophy, because I guess everybody tries to joke, but they're usually pretty dry. And it's kind of nice to have a writing style such as you guys, where it is kind of a little more lighthearted, but it still keeps the information flowing.
Right, and that's one thing that's really been, I think, so helpful for me. David and I have been married a little over 6 years, so both of us, we were a little older when we got married. Both of us already had our PhDs. Both of us were doing things professionally. Both of us were teaching at Liberty. But I think because our fields are close but not the same, I think the relationship, the marriage, obviously the academic collaboration with this book, I think we've just been able to open up new pathways, things that are, again, very similar material, but kind of seeing it from a new angle. We're able to, I think, strengthen one another in that way.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's a great book. Everyone should pick up a copy for sure.
Thank you.
So David, I'll swing back to you. Probably one of my favorite bits in the book, because I guess I've studied a little bit of that, is how you compare Paul and Socrates. And I think that's a great kind of, I guess, theme, if you want to call it that. Now, other than the obvious bit where they're both zealous, maybe you could share with the audience some of the comparisons and situations that you discussed.
Yeah. I happened to be reading Acts 17 around the same time as I was rereading Socrates' Apology some years back, and it just dawned on me the conspicuous similarities and kind of overlaps between these two guys. I thought them really interesting. You mentioned the zeal. They both certainly had that. They both had a great capacity to tick people off. But they both saw themselves as on something of a divine mission. People might not realize that Socrates saw himself as on a divine mission, but if you read the Apology and a few other of the early dialogues, or middle or later, you begin to realize that he would say this. It was a recurring theme, that he saw himself as sent by God to ask questions, to be the conscience of his society, to be a gadfly and so forth. And Paul likewise obviously saw himself as on a divine mission. They were both there in Athens, Paul in Acts 17, and then of course Socrates was from there. They both questioned the kind of prevailing views of the day. Sometimes people liked it, sometimes people didn't. They were obviously both very actively involved in the public square. Interestingly enough, they both believed, and this was an eye-opener for me, in something like a coming reckoning, an ultimate judgment. Again, you might not associate that with Socrates, but it's right there. If you go back and you reread the Apology, you'll find numerous references to it. And Paul, in Acts 17, makes reference to this too. So I thought, well, that might not be a coincidence. But then something happened that was absolutely remarkable to me. I came across this major point of disanalogy. There was this one big difference, and it's huge. It's absolutely central. Socrates, you know, right, was very well known for saying, look, I don't know. I mean, there are some things that he was convinced about, like, you know, morality was objective, there was going to be a coming reckoning and that sort of thing. But take, for instance, in the Euthyphro, in his discussion with the young Euthyphro, he would say, well, I don't know exactly what piety is or holiness or justice. You know, explain this to me. And this was kind of his shtick. It was his modus operandi. He'd go around asking people these questions and claiming not to know himself. So he'd ask poets and politicians and so forth. And, you know, he was very good at revealing their ignorance. And he often didn't give a positive answer himself. He would say, I'm ignorant. I don't know. So there Paul is 4 centuries later, and he's talking at Mars Hill, you know, and you can see the Parthenon in the distance, and he's needling people with questions too, but and making reference to the judgment and the coming reckoning to you know, the reckoning to come and so forth. But despite these similarities with Socrates, the one big difference was Paul said this in Athens. So again, no coincidence. He said, the hour of ignorance is over, right? So people had to connect that with Socrates, right? This was Athens, where Socrates was so known for these claims of ignorance, and Paul coming along, resonating with lots of what Socrates had to say, but then distancing himself on this point and saying, because of the resurrection of Jesus, the hour of ignorance is over, which makes that coming reckoning, needless to say, all the more pressing. But he would talk about this resurrection, anastasis, you know, and of course the Greeks were like, who is that? What God is that? That's a new God. We're not familiar with this anastasis. It was Greek for resurrection. Mm-hmm. He was introducing to them the fact that this Jesus fellow had died, had been raised from the dead, and that was a game changer.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Gosh, I wish I could have been there. So, Marybeth, we'll slide on to another chapter. Perhaps before we talk about it, could you explain kind of the differences of abduction, deduction, and induction? Because the chapter's on stubborn moral facts, and you use the technique of abduction through most of that one.
Right. Okay, so as a non-philosopher, I'm going to try to do my best. But hopefully that will help maybe, convey it a little bit more. So all three, of course, are types of reasoning, different ways that you can go about making up an argument. They have different strengths and weaknesses, different reasons that you'd want to deploy, different ones in different situations. we did not use deduction or induction, so I'll just kind of start with those, set them aside, and then talk a little bit more about abduction. So deductive arguments, basically your evidence is going to logically guarantee your conclusion. This is the one that William Lane Craig goes with most often, presenting the moral argument. So it goes like this. If God does not exist, then objective moral duties and values don't exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. So that's the argument that he typically presents, but we chose to go a little bit different route. Induction and abduction are both non-deductive arguments. Induction is going to focus on probabilities. And so, for example, you go to a restaurant, 9 times, and it has great food, so you can just kind of, most likely, probably, you're going to enjoy that same restaurant the 10th one. Not logically connected. There's just a chance, a good chance, but not really something that you can guarantee. Abduction, also a non-deductive argument. That's the one that we go with in the morals of the story, and a lot of people don't really know much about abduction, so we spend a little bit of time talking about it, but it's an inference to the best explanation. So what you do here, and this is something that we do automatically, even if we don't know the name of it. So say you have a given, you have something that is a fact. You go outside and you notice that the grass is wet, for example. You start thinking about what are some possible candidates, some reasons for it. Most likely it rained. That's the most likely thing that would explain that. So that's what we do with the morals of the story with regards to the moral argument. So we start with these stubborn moral facts, as the chapter says. These moral facts that are in need of explanation. Things that anybody that you would talk with, unless they're moral skeptics, unless they completely reject the idea that there are moral facts, would agree with. Things like goodness, questions of moral value, that human beings have dignity, for example, is one of the things that we explore in the book. Or obligations, these duties that people would typically recognize we have. And then say, okay, we can agree on this. Here's the stubborn moral facts. Here are things that we would agree on. Now let's explore what might best explain that. And so that's the project that we undertake in this book. We engage with the secular theories that are on offer, kind of highlight strengths. I mean, they live in this world. This is the world that we all, can navigate, agree on, recognize these truths, and then what is it that might explore it? And so there are some strengths that secular theories might offer, and we explore some of those, but then also point out their weaknesses. And so ultimately, what we do here in the morals of the story is really, I think it's kind of a cumulative case. It sort of builds, given the demands of reality, given the facts that we would agree on, given questions of the need for moral transformation, or questions about whether or not the moral project actually is rational to undertake. Can happiness and holiness cohere, for example? What is it that might best explain it? We think that we've presented a pretty strong case that Christian theism, theism and Christian theism in particular, really does best explain it. And I will mention this. One benefit, and David's the one that really has explored this quite a bit in his academic work and, has gotten me on board with. One real important, I think, significant benefit for approaching the moral argument in this way, really starting with things that we can agree on, the person that you're engaging with, that both of you can agree on, non-negotiable moral facts, is that it really does build a bridge, and it really does encourage conversation. That's one thing that we really tried to do in the morals of the story. And I think we can all agree, with our current very contentious cultural moment, the more bridges built, the better, the more conversations started, the better, and I think the objective moral argument really does offer that.
Well, thank you, Marybeth. And at Edge of Faith, we definitely believe in bridge building, so thank you for focusing on that thing. Conversation and the exchange of ideas is what it's all about. David, I was reading the chapter on moral knowledge, and I really was engrossed in that. You know, you're discussing evolutionary ethics and evolutionary naturalism and Neoplatonism, and I'm like, you know, all the thought that goes into, you know, where does moral knowledge come from? And I thought, how apropos to discuss that in comparison to today's society, where, you know, there was more thought that you put in that chapter on where does it come from than where people think they get it today. I mean, 280 characters in a social media platform or a soundbite, and people are full of righteous knowledge. And so, you know, I thought it might be good and apropos for you to maybe discuss the three parts of propositional knowledge and just kind of enlighten the reader a bit on this subject.
Sure. Yeah, and there are different kinds of knowledge. So, you know, sometimes we just talk about competence knowledge, like I know how to ride a bike, or acquaintance knowledge, like I know Chicago or something like that, or I know a person. But propositional knowledge of propositions, like I know that it is raining, something like that. And so philosophers have spent a lot of time talking about, well, what are the ingredients of that? And there's not always agreement on this, and there's a lot of technical issues that can be gotten into. But setting most of that aside, the truth seems to be something, at least in the vicinity of, requiring three things in most paradigmatic cases. So something like justification or evidence, and you need truth, and you need to believe it. So if you're dealing with a proposition and you believe it, and it's a true proposition, and you have adequate evidence, or some might instead suggest something like warrant for believing the proposition in question, then you can plausibly claim to know it. You know, I know this to be true. I might not know that I know it to be true, but I know it to be true. So we started this chapter by talking about these sort of ingredients of knowledge, just to kind of get people on board before we talked about the specifically epistemic version of the moral argument, which is one aspect of our fourfold case. And so with respect to these three ingredients, justification, truth, and belief, you can just quickly say a few interesting things about each that I think probably are particularly apropos for us to remember in this day and age in which we live. And by the way, and this connects with something that Marybeth said in that last answer, you know, we wrote this book in the middle of that very contentious election. And what we saw as a troubling sign was that a lot of that contention and tendentiousness that we were seeing in the public square concerning politics was getting altogether too much appropriated in the arena of apologetics, especially online. You know, not the great, well-known apologists, but a lot of the amateur apologists out there are falling into this trap of really thinking that it's about winning an argument and knocking down your opponent and scoring these points and so forth and so on. And we really wanted to battle that and offer an alternative. And so what we do in this book is say, let's slow down, let's turn down the heat, let's live with these ideas and allow them to sink in and feel their force. But let's not think about winning an argument. Let's really think about building bridges and winning people. So it sounds a little cliche, but it really is so important. So, okay, with respect to justification, truth, and belief, just a few words on each. So justification is this idea of evidence. And I think we as Christians have to really take seriously the intellectual responsibility we have to cultivate excellence in assessing evidence. You know, we're not doing faith any favors. In fact, we're doing it a great disservice by treating it simply as something that's blind, that's something that operates independently of the evidence. We really have to cultivate the ability to recognize good reasons and then to follow them, to assess evidence accurately, and to follow the evidence where it leads. And if we're not doing this consistently and we're not doing it well, we're not going to make for good evangelists and good apologists. We're going to instead appear to be kind of anti-intellectual or dishonest. With respect to truth, the Bible says a lot about truth. And, of course, we live in postmodern times where some people have been giving up this idea of truth. And at the same time, ironically, but perhaps there is a connection, other people seem to be ratcheting it up, where it's not just a matter of, you know, this is the truth and I happen to know the truth, but you're not just wrong, you're just evil, you know. And again, there's this acidic element to the public discourse where Conversation is breaking down, and instead of truth and evidence, people just point to their own passion. I just believe this so passionately. How could you possibly disagree with me? And of course, this doesn't conduce to civil discourse or an advance in the conversation at all. We need to take truth seriously as objective, as not about how deeply we believe in it. It's just correspondence with reality. And how do we get an idea as to what that is? We look at the evidence that's been provided, and we pay very careful heed. We cultivate great attentiveness to the evidence as it stands, and then we follow that evidence where it leads. And we're not dogmatic, but we care about truth, and we follow the evidence. Well, belief. What about belief? Now, you might think, that's an easy one. Well, I know what it means to believe something. Yeah, ask me if I believe something, and I'll tell you. On occasion, though, we might honestly assent to something that we think we believe, and we actually don't believe it. So the one thing that I might wish to emphasize with respect to belief in this context is that what actually most effectively reflects our beliefs is not what we assent to, even honestly. It's what our behaviors demonstrate. So if someone says they believe that they don't fear flying, but you watch them with their white knuckles, clenched on their seats every time they get into the airplane, you realize they might not know it, but they actually are afraid of flying, right? Our behaviors show what we believe even more than what we honestly assent to, because we can sometimes be a little self-deceived, or we can be a little damaged and not know it, and we're all damaged, let's face it. I mean, I remember an exercise years ago in an epistemology book that a friend of mine and I were going through, and it said, can you identify a belief of yours that, on reflection, is likely false? So try to get your mind around that. Can you identify a belief of yours that, on reflection, you'd say is likely false? Now, you might think, well, that's impossible, because if I think it's likely false, it means I don't believe it, right? But we're complicated creatures, and we're not just logic choppers. We're emotional, we're relational, and so forth. So I actually came to this kind of insight. Oftentimes people, by their behavior, demonstrate that they hold to a belief down deep, of which they might not even be consciously aware, and their behaviors show it to be the case, right? So if you ask them, they say they don't believe it, but actually down deep they do. On reflection, then they would say, that is likely false. But down deep, I seem to believe that after all. And that's, maybe sometimes why a counseling session could be useful and helpful and so forth. And even there, suppose you have a belief that crops up around some prior hurt in your heart, happening in childhood or some such thing. It doesn't fix it just to become aware of it, right? That's just the start of the process, where you then have to maybe pray in a specific, strategic, targeted way for God to send you healing in that particular place in your brokenness. And then over time, maybe that belief down deep can be replaced, and it will be borne out by your actions. Anyway, there's more to belief than people realize. But if you put all these things together, justification, truth, and belief, the idea is then you can know something. And I think that knowledge is something that we should aim for. Again, not in a dogmatic way, but in an intellectually honest way. And that's much of what apologetics is all about.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. So I guess we're coming up on the close of the interview, but Marybeth, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave the reader?
Sure. This is actually related to what David just said, and you had mentioned earlier that this book is not simply for non-Christians to read and hear an argument for God's existence, or even for Christians to read to get an argument that they can use in conversation with non-believers. This is for Christian and non-Christians alike. This question of morality is so just, it does speak to the heart. It really does speak to the mind as well. And as someone who has come to it much more recently from David, I've been a Christian all of my life, and so I didn't need to hear the argument as a non-Christian to be introduced to Christian theism, but as a Christian to really be challenged with questions of what I believe about God, because the moral argument is not simply an argument that God exists, but it really centers on, and this is key, that God is good. This is in the subtitle of the book itself, The Morals of the Story, Good News About a Good God. And the character of God is absolutely crucial to the questions that are raised around the moral argument. And in reading David's work, in working on this book with him, I really have been, as I said, challenged about what my beliefs are about God. And I certainly am I have been one of the ones who could easily state, things like John 3:16, for God so loved the world, or 1 John 4, God is love. But I don't know that I've always fully believed it, and it's certainly something that I continue to struggle with. And I think it's a process of really trusting God and really relinquishing any hurts, any times that you may have felt like, where was God when I was suffering? And so this book and working on it has really put that to me. And I think, if we're honest, there really are a lot of Christians who struggle with that question of whether God really is love. Is God really good? Sometimes in the evangelical subculture, when morality is brought up, the first thoughts we have are rules and punishment and sort of this harsh judgment. And certainly there's a truth there. But why isn't it the first thing that we think of that God is good, that God is love, that there is forgiveness available, that there is reconciliation and resurrection, that those are the more fundamental truths? And yes, the others are there, but that deep truth that God is love is the foundation on which all of that other stuff rests. And this has really helped me, I think. Not that I'm fully there. Definitely have a process that God is working through me. But I do think that is something we really tried to highlight in the book. And so this book really is for Christians and non-Christians alike, and I think Christians can be challenged with that. And so I would encourage people to read it with that in mind.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. I don't mean to put a kink in it or anything, but that's the wonderful thing about ideas and thoughts, too, is you'd have to define what really is love, too, versus what you think love is.
Right.
But that's a whole nother interview, so...
read the book.
Exactly. David, do you have anything you'd like to add as well?
Well, I just so enjoyed what she said, and I would definitely reiterate that. Remember, Paul and Socrates emphasized that coming judgment, the coming reckoning. But Christianity, we talk about the proclamation of the gospel as good news. So you might say the bad news is just sort of the prelude to the good news, right? So we have a problem. We need transformation. We need forgiveness. We need change. We need a relationship with God. We need that alienation to be removed. The good news is that these things are actually available. And I was so touched, too, by what she said about love. I think that's so true, this idea of God being love. And I know it is its own podcast, but I honestly do think that even a lot of Christians are confused on this issue and harbor deep down doubts and fears about whether God really likes them and loves them. Mm-hmm. And the gloriously good news is that God really does, in the sense that he wants what's absolutely best for each and every one of us. God truly does love you. And if we could believe that and appropriate that, I think it really could be life-changing for us all. And so this is one of the ways in which moral apologetics really speaks to the brass tacks. I mean, it just comes alive at the most practicable of levels. And two last things, one in connection with this, but first I want to make mention of, we have a site called moralapologetics.com, and if anyone is interested, they could go there. It's kind of a central research hub, all kinds of materials out there for those who want to pursue these ideas more. And then secondly, I kind of want to point to someone in life who almost like physically embodied so much of what we're talking about. He didn't maybe talk so much about the truths of moral apologetics. What he did was he embodied what these things looked like, that people truly have dignity, that people are special, that they deserve to be loved and liked, and they're able to be loved and to be liked and to love others. I'm actually talking about Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, whose documentary recently came out. If you haven't seen it, I so encourage you to take a look. It's just a wonderful story about a wonderful man. And, one of the things he said was one of his life goals as a Christian, because he was an ordained Presbyterian minister. A lot of people don't know that.
Right.
One of his goals was to make goodness attractive. And I would just like to end on this note by saying, you don't have to be a philosopher to take the moral argument seriously and to see its implications and to apply it in real life. Love your neighbor as yourself. Demonstrate your love for God by loving your neighbor as yourself. In so doing, your very life can be a moral apologetic, like his was. So many people, believers and unbelievers alike, have looked at a guy like that and have recognized intuitively that there's something so special, something so undeniably special about the way in which he cherished children and reached out to the needy and made people feel loved and was willing to listen to what people were going through and to be a good neighbor and a loving friend. Wonderful man. I want to write a book on him. That's why I'm kind of thinking about him a lot lately.
Awesome.
But I really think he's a great example of real life moral apologetics in action.
Well, amen to that. Well, thank you guys once again for talking to us. And the title of the book.
Much.
Sure. And the title of the book is The Moral of the Story, Good News About a Good God. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.